It's been exactly 13 years since George R.R. Martin last published a book in the series of A Song of Ice and Fire. A Dance with Dragons came out on this day in 2011, and since then we've all been waiting for him to finish Winds of Winter. And every couple years he says something or he hints at something that builds up anticipation for this book, and then he just tears it all down and says there's no update and nothing's been finished. The latest little kernel of hope came from a blog post on George's blog, Not a Blog, where, by the way, he writes all the fucking time, where he said he was meeting with publishers in London this week, and that the last time he told the public he was meeting with them, the internet went crazy. Here's a summary of what he said on the blog. Last year, when I mentioned seeing my Voyager editor in London, the internet went nuts, throwing up all sorts of theories about how that meant Winds of Winter was done, and there was a huge announcement was at hand. Sorry guys, but no, that's not how it works. Making contacts, which often turns into friendship, is a huge part of publishing, blah, blah, blah. He then goes on to talk about how he's friends with everyone in the publishing world and that he keeps in contact and he hangs out with them whether or not he's even publishing. He says, if I fly to Germany for a con or a book fair, I'll see my German agents and publishers and translators. Or if it's in Italy or Spain or Finland or something, if I ever find myself in Brazil or Japan or Egypt, I try to connect with my Brazilian, Japanese, or Egyptian publishers. I got an idea. Quit flying from fucking Germany to Finland to Spain and write your fucking book, man. Quit writing in your Not a blog diary and write the fucking dragon story, dude. I have such a love-hate, fake, made-up, parasocial relationship with Double R, because on the one hand, I love that furry little fucker. Not only did he create this entire world and give us the first 5 books, which led to the amazing television, but he's also just the best, most successful, lovable nerd on the planet. The way we all spent our childhood thinking about witches and warlocks and kings and queens and dragons, and then eventually we grew up and got shitty jobs and life lost all of its magic, he just kept going. He never worried about being cool a day in his life. Grew up in fucking Bayonne, New Jersey, probably surrounded by a bunch of Italians who were bullying him when he read comic books and talked about sci-fi, and he just kept on going until it eventually paid off and he made like $121 million and decided to become a fashion icon by wearing a train conductor hat everywhere he goes. If you can't get down with that story arc, then you stink. But at some point, you use up all your good favor by making literally everybody wait a decade. Like, don't tell me that you're halfway done with Winds of Winter, and don't even fucking mention A Dream of Spring if you're not gonna get this shit done, man. At this point, I consider this series, it's like Dr. Dre's Detox or Tony Hawk's Skate Jam. We ain't ever gonna get it. And as much as that bothers me, I understand why, because it's a complete lose-lose proposition for George R.R. Martin. He gave the HBO showrunners the major plot points. You'd have to imagine things like Bran on the throne, Dany going Mad Queen, Arya defeats the Night King, so on and so forth. And those are all the things we hated. That season aired and George must have been like, oh shit, nobody liked that, huh? So he more or less told the world how he wanted Winds of Winter to end, and everyone hates it with such vitriol, they run around saying it ruined the entire series. Now, one could argue that if maybe the book was written, the story would be more thorough, those major plot points would come to make sense, and that the only reason we hated it is because it was rushed by TV producers, and that if the original writer were to finish it, it would all click. But I would say pretty much anything that resembles the 8th season of that TV show, people are absolutely gonna hate. So now George is faced with the proposition of finishing a story that he already knows the public hates, or he forces a new ending, which will no doubt also suck because he's basically writing it under duress, and his heart and mind won't be in it, because that's not the way his brain, where all this came from, wanted it to go. So why do all that work to put out a book that you will either know sucks by your own standards, or will suck by the public standards? That's a lot of work for a doomed project. It's easier to just ride it out, wait till you die, let the showrunners take all the heat. And while it was completely botched by Benioff and Weiss, they definitely take a whole bunch of heat for how they finished an extremely complicated story that they didn't write. I mean, don't get me wrong, I hate them with the fire of 1,000 suns, and I would wage war upon them and their house if I could for what they did to that series in season 8 and how they rushed to get it done because they thought they were going to do fucking Star Wars. But I think it was a safe assumption on their part that he would finish the source material over the course of, a decade? Imagine you, a regular-ass person, baking a cake with the first half of the cake with a recipe from a world-class baker, but the second half, you just gotta wing it. Oh, you know the general idea. There's some eggs, some flour, some water, but you have no fucking clue on how to include it, and the timing, and the pacing, and the technique, none of it. You just have to make it up. And then when the cake sucks, it's your fault? For sure not. At the end of the day, I blame the New York Jets. All of this comes from George being a Jets fan. Because as a fellow Jets fan, I know that franchise poisons the mind. It's like werewood trees or shade of the evening. They've warped your brain into the one day mentality. One day it'll happen. One day we'll have a quarterback. One day we'll win a championship. One day I'll finish Winds of Winter. It's never gonna happen, George. Not as long as you're under their spell, waiting for them to win. You're 75. You're not gonna see a championship and you're not finishing that book. Pass it off to some young nerd on Reddit who can write in your style, who publish some great fan fiction. Let them write under your name. Like how I've read 5 Jason Bourne books that are by Robert Ludlum like 10 years after he died. Let them write a version where Jon Snow kills the Night King and Arya kills Cersei. Dany sits on the throne as a benevolent queen with her husband Jon by her side. Tyrion and Bronn live out their days living lavish in Dorne. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Because otherwise, this shit ain't ever gonna get published. Winter is coming, but Winds of Winter ain't.